Mrs. Gable did not look up from the ledger on her mahogany desk. Her voice carried the cold weight of a winter morning in Philadelphia. She told Maeve that her presence at the upcoming autumn gala was required, though she considered it a waste of fine silk. Maeve kept her fingers steady as she worked a needle through the hem of her dark woolen dress. The parlor felt small today, the heavy velvet drapes shutting out the pale city sunlight, leaving the room thick with the scent of lavender water and silent judgment. Maeve was 26 years old, an age her mother frequently reminded her was past the point of practical hope. Her younger sister, Iris, adjusted her own bright lace collar in the mirror, laughing softly. Iris was 19, full of color and easy smiles, her gown a bright pink that rustled with every movement of her feet. Iris remarked that Maeve always chose to look like a shadow, as if she wanted the guests to mistake her for the serving staff. Their mother agreed without looking up, stating that Maeve's plain appearance reflected poorly on the family name. Vivian, the middle sister, entered the room with a stack of invitation cards, her dark eyes flashing with satisfaction as she looked at Maeve's simple attire. Vivian told her mother that perhaps it was best for Maeve to hide in the corners, so the eligible gentleman could focus on those who actually possessed prospects. Maeve did not lower her head. She had learned long ago that words only cut if you gave them permission to land. She told her mother that the dark dress was clean, paid for, and perfectly adequate for an evening of observation. Mrs. Gable snapped the ledger shut, the sound sharp in the quiet room. She reminded Maeve that their father's business affairs were failing, and that it was the duty of every daughter to secure a marriage that could save their home. She accused Maeve of failing in that duty, calling her a stubborn burden who preferred books to the realities of survival. The grand ballroom in the heart of Philadelphia blazed with the light of 500 candles that evening. The air was warm, thick with the scent of expensive perfume, roasting meats, and the low hum of hundreds of wealthy voices. Maeve found her place near the glass conservatory doors, standing beside a row of potted palms that offered a small measure of shelter. Across the polished floor, her mother was already deep in conversation with a wealthy merchant, while Vivian and Iris laughed with a circle of young officers. Maeve watched the crowd, noting the false smiles and the sharp calculations behind every glance. Then the room grew noticeably quieter. A man stepped through the main archway, and the crowd parted as if responding to an unspoken command. He was tall, his shoulders broad under a coat of midnight black. His hair was completely white, falling in clean lines around a face that looked as though it had been carved from pale stone. His eyes were a striking, cool silver, catching the candlelight as he surveyed the room without a single trace of warmth. Maeve heard the whispers rippling through the crowd. It was Caspian, a man the papers called the King of the Night, a reclusive billionaire who rarely left his massive estate in the northern forests. A young gentleman, unsteady from too many glasses of champagne, stumbled backward into Maeve's corner. His elbow caught her arm, sending her glass of water tilting forward. A dark, wet stain spread across the front of her plain dress. The young man offered a brief, slurred apology before his friends dragged him away toward the card tables. Maeve pulled a linen handkerchief from her pocket, attempting to blot the moisture from the fabric, keeping her eyes fixed on the floor to avoid the stares of the nearby guests. She looked up to see Vivian watching her from across the floor, a sharp smile on her lips. Vivian leaned in to whisper something to the young woman beside her, and both of them hid their faces behind lace fans, their shoulders shaking with silent amusement. Maeve felt a brief heat rise in her cheeks, the familiar sting of public ridicule in a room designed for display. She took a slow breath, willing herself to become invisible once more, counting the minutes until the carriages would be called. A long shadow fell across her, shutting out the glare of the chandeliers. Maeve looked up and found herself facing Caspian. Close to him, his pale skin seemed to possess a faint, translucent quality, and his white hair framed eyes that were looking directly into her own. He did not look at the stain on her dress. He looked at her face with a steady, quiet intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. His touch, as his hand brushed the frame of the glass door beside her, sent a sudden chill through the air. He spoke in a low, deep voice that carried no trace of the city's hurried rhythm. He told her that some accidents were entirely too convenient for those who enjoyed watching others stumble. Maeve managed to say that it was merely a clumsy moment, nothing worth noting. Caspian glanced briefly toward Vivian, then looked back at Maeve, a small movement at the corner of his lips that was almost a smile. He told her that he had spent the evening watching the room, and she was the only person in it who did not seem to be wearing a mask. He asked if her family was enjoying the gathering, his emphasis on the word family revealing that he had seen exactly how they treated her. Maeve replied that her mother and sisters found the evening highly successful. Caspian stood with her for another long moment, his cool presence a strange island of stillness in the noisy ballroom. He told her that he preferred the quiet of the woods to the chatter of the city, then gave a brief nod and walked away, disappearing into the crowd as silently as he had arrived. Maeve stood by the palms, her heart beating a fast, steady rhythm against her ribs, the memory of his silver eyes staying with her, long after the candles began to burn low. 3 days later, a long, glossy black town car pulled up outside the Gable residence. The arrival caused an immediate panic among the serving staff. The cook dropped a pewter tray in the kitchen, and Mrs. Gable hurried to the front windows, her face pale with sudden excitement. She called Vivian and Iris to the parlor at once, her voice shaking as she told them that Caspian had arrived at their door. Vivian immediately began smoothing her dark curls, stating that he must have noticed her during their brief greeting at the gala. Maeve remained in the small back study, working through the household bills that her father had left behind. The door opened, and their old butler stood on the threshold, his hands trembling as he held a silver tray. He told Maeve that the gentleman with the white hair was in the front room, and that he had specifically requested to speak with her father and the eldest daughter. Maeve laid her pen aside, leaving a small black ink mark on the edge of the paper, and walked toward the parlor. The atmosphere in the front room was thick with tension when Maeve entered. Her mother and sisters stood near the bookcase, their expressions a mixture of confusion and anger. Her father sat in his armchair, looking small and exhausted, his hands rubbing his knees. Caspian stood near the fireplace, his white hair contrasting sharply with his dark woolen coat. His pale skin looked even more striking in the morning light, and he turned his silver eyes toward Maeve as she crossed the threshold. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He looked at Maeve's father and stated that he was fully aware of the family's financial situation. He noted that the debts amounted to several $1,000s, a sum that would soon strip them of their home and status. Mrs. Gable stepped forward to speak, but Caspian raised a single pale hand, and the sheer authority in his gesture silenced her instantly. He turned back to Maeve, his expression remaining completely calm and unreadable. He told her that he required a wife, a lady to manage his estate in the northern woods of Maine, and to represent his name when necessity demanded. He stated plainly that he was not offering a match based on romance or sentiment. He required a partner who possessed intelligence, composure, and a practical mind. He told her that if she accepted his proposal, he would pay her father's debts in full on the day of their wedding, ensuring her family's comfort and providing her with a secure position of her own. The room remained absolutely silent for several long seconds. Maeve looked at her father, whose eyes were wide with a sudden, desperate hope. She looked at her mother and sisters, who were staring at her with undisguised shock. Caspian stood perfectly still, waiting for her response, his cool presence filling the small parlor. Maeve realized that he was offering her a choice between two different kinds of confinement, but this new one offered distance from the people who had spent years making her feel small. She stepped closer to him, noting the faint scent of pine wood and cold air that seemed to follow him. She asked why he had chosen her when there were many women in the city who would gladly accept his name. Caspian replied that he had no desire for a woman who spent her days seeking the approval of a crowd. He told her that he valued her quiet resilience, a quality he had observed during their short encounter at the gala. Maeve took a slow breath and told him that she accepted his terms. She stated that she would hold up her end of the arrangement, managing his household with the care he required. Caspian nodded once, a gesture of finality. He told her father that his legal representative would call on him the following morning to finalize the financial transfers, and that the wedding would take place by special license at the end of the week. The announcement of the agreement brought a storm of anger through the house. Once Caspian had departed, Mrs. Gable sank into her chair, her face red with frustration. Vivian walked to the window, her voice sharp as she accused Maeve of using deceit to catch the attention of a wealthy, reclusive man. Vivian shouted that it was an insult for a plain older sister to be taken before those who had worked for years to secure a proper place in society. Mrs. Gable told Maeve that she should feel no pride in the arrangement, calling her a piece of property that had been purchased to settle a merchant's debt. She stated that Caspian had chosen the most desperate option available, looking for someone who would ask no questions and make no demands. Maeve did not answer the insults. She walked past her sisters and went up to her small bedroom, where she began packing her few belongings into an old leather trunk. The wedding took place on a cold Friday morning at a small stone church near the city docks. The sky was gray, a sharp wind blowing from the river. The only witnesses were Maeve's father and an elderly woman with sharp blue eyes who introduced herself as Caspian's aunt, Beatrix. Maeve wore a simple traveling dress of dark blue wool, while Caspian stood beside her in his customary black. His white hair seemed to catch the dim light of the church, and his hand was noticeably cold when he placed the plain gold band on her finger. Aunt Beatrix walked over to Maeve as they signed the church registry. She laid a dry, wrinkled hand over Maeve's fingers, nodding firmly. The old woman remarked that Maeve possessed a steady hand, a quality she would need in the months to come. She told Maeve that Caspian was a man who carried a great deal of shadow, and that the northern house had been silent for far too long. The journey north lasted 2 days, moving from the crowded train lines into a private carriage that took them deep into the pine forests of Maine. The air grew progressively colder, and the snow began to pile thick along the sides of the narrow dirt road. Caspian sat opposite Maeve in the carriage, his eyes fixed on the dark trees passing outside the glass. He did not speak, but his silence did not feel angry. It felt like the heavy quiet of a winter forest before a storm. They arrived at the gates of Coldbrook Manor just as twilight was turning to complete darkness. The estate was immense, a massive structure of dark gray stone that seemed to rise directly out of the rocky ground. Tall pine trees crowded the edges of the clearing, their branches heavy with white snow. Only a few windows on the ground floor showed the faint yellow glow of lamps, leaving the rest of the great house dark against the night sky. The carriage stopped before the wide stone steps, and a small group of servants lined the path. An elderly housekeeper in a plain black dress stood at the front, her hands clasped tightly before her. Caspian stepped out of the vehicle and reached back to help Maeve down. His grip was firm and ice-cold through her woolen gloves. He welcomed her to her new home, his voice flat and formal in the crisp night air. Inside, the great hall was vast, the floor made of alternating squares of black and white marble that echoed with the sound of their boots. A large stone fireplace occupied one wall, containing a small fire that did little to warm the cavernous space. Heavy wooden doors led off into darkness, and the air smelled of old paper, cedar wood, and a deep-settled chill. The housekeeper, Mrs. Weaver, curtsied deeply, her eyes fixed on the floor. Caspian turned to Maeve and told her that her rooms had been prepared in the west wing. He stated that as he had several urgent matters to attend to in his study and would not be joining her for the evening meal. He told Mrs. Weaver to ensure the Duchess had everything she required, then turned and walked down a dark corridor, his footsteps making no sound at all on the stone floor. Maeve followed the housekeeper up the wide stairs, feeling the immense weight of the silent house closing in around her. Maeve woke the next morning to the sound of wind rattling the window panes. A pale winter sun was rising over the tops of the pine trees, casting long shadows across her bedroom floor. The rooms were spacious, filled with heavy walnut furniture and faded green carpets that spoke of wealth from a different era. A young maid named Hazel entered with a pitcher of hot water, her eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and nervousness, as she greeted the new mistress. Maeve dressed in a practical gown of dark green wool and made her way downstairs. The great house was completely silent, the long corridors empty of life. She found the dining room, where a single plate and teacup had been set at the far end of a table that could easily hold 30 guests. A young footman served her hot tea and bread, informing her that the Duke did not take breakfast in the mornings and spent his daylight hours in his private study. After finishing her solitary meal, Maeve decided to explore her surroundings. She refused to remain confined to her rooms like a guest waiting for an invitation. She walked through the ground floor, discovering parlor after parlor where the furniture was hidden beneath pale canvas covers. Portraits of pale-faced ancestors with dark eyes looked down at her from the high walls, their expressions grim and unyielding in their gilded frames. She found the library at the end of the east corridor, and the sight brought a sudden feeling of relief. The room was 2 stories high, its walls lined from floor to ceiling with thousands of leather-bound volumes. A rolling wooden ladder rested against the upper shelves, and 2 large leather armchairs sat before a cold stone hearth. The air here smelled of aged paper and leather, a familiar comfort that made the massive house feel slightly less hostile. Maeve spent several hours browsing the shelves, running her fingers along the spines of books concerning history, agriculture, and poetry. She pulled down a large volume filled with detailed drawings of winter plants. Settling into one of the leather chairs to read, she became so absorbed in the pages that she did not hear the door open, starting slightly when a low voice spoke from the shadows near the entrance. Caspian stood there, watching her with his silver eyes. He was dressed in a simple black shirt and trousers, his white hair messy, as if he had been running his fingers through it. He told her that he did not mean to frighten her, and that the library was now hers to use as she pleased. Maeve closed the book in her lap, telling him that she had found the room to be the warmest place in the manor. He walked slowly into the light of the window, his pale skin appearing almost silver in the daylight. He looked down at the volume in her lap, noting that the drawings were old but accurate. He told her that the estate had once possessed a large winter glasshouse filled with rare flowers, but it had fallen into neglect over the past few years. Maeve suggested that perhaps the glasshouse could be restored, stating that she had always found satisfaction in making things grow. Caspian looked at her for a long moment, his face remaining perfectly still. He told her that she was free to try, though the soil in these parts was stubborn and did not yield easily to strangers. He informed her that his Aunt Beatrix would be arriving later that afternoon to spend the winter months with them, and that she would expect tea in the small parlor at 4 o'clock. He then turned and left the room, his white hair catching the light for a brief second, before the heavy door clicked shut behind him. Aunt Beatrix arrived in a small carriage just as the afternoon light was beginning to fade. The old woman did not seem affected by the cold, walking into the great hall with a sharp, energetic step that immediately altered the quiet mood of the house. She looked at Maeve, who was waiting to receive her, and nodded with obvious approval. She remarked that Maeve did not look like she had spent her first days weeping in her rooms, which she considered a promising start. They sat together in the small parlor, where a bright fire had been lit. Beatrix took her teacup from Maeve's hands, her sharp blue eyes scanning the young woman's face. She told Maeve that Caspian was a difficult man to understand, especially for someone raised in the city. She explained that the house had been plunged into darkness 3 years ago, following the death of Caspian's younger brother, Tristan. Beatrix lowered her voice, stating that Tristan had been a lively, reckless young man who loved riding fast horses through the winter woods. He had taken a young, unbroken stallion out during a severe ice storm, despite Caspian's explicit warnings. The horse had stumbled on a rocky ridge 5 miles from the house, and Tristan had been killed instantly. She told Maeve that Caspian had carried the body back to the manor himself, and that he had never forgiven himself for letting his brother go out that day. She explained that Caspian had locked the east wing immediately after the funeral, forbidding anyone from entering Tristan's old rooms. He had withdrawn from the world, letting the estate fall into disrepair and spending his nights pacing the empty corridors. Beatrix told Maeve that Caspian had married her, simply because his advisors insisted he needed a duchess to manage the family name, but that it was up to Maeve whether she would let herself be frozen out by his grief. That evening, Maeve took her place at the long dining table for dinner. Caspian entered a few minutes later, his white hair neatly combed, taking his seat at the opposite end of the immense mahogany expanse. The distance between them was nearly 30 feet, making any natural conversation impossible without shouting across the empty space. Maeve watched the footmen move silently between them, their faces tense in the dim candlelight. Maeve stood up from her chair, holding her linen napkin in her hand. She walked down the length of the room until she stood near Caspian's chair. She told him that she found the current arrangement to be entirely impractical for two people who shared a home. Caspian raised his silver eyes, his expression showing a faint trace of surprise at her sudden movement. She suggested that a small round table be brought into the room for their daily meals, stating that she preferred to speak with her husband rather than call out to him across a barren stretch of wood. Caspian looked at the long empty table, then back at Maeve's steady face. He called the head footman over and instructed him to make the change for the following evening, stating that his wife's request was entirely sensible. When they sat down the next night, they were close enough to see the reflections of the candles in each other's eyes. The silence was still present, but it felt smaller, less intimidating. Caspian asked her about her family in Philadelphia, his voice quiet. Maeve told him the truth, stating that her mother and sisters valued appearance above all things, and that she had never felt entirely at home in their world. Caspian replied that he understood the desire to escape a place where you were constantly expected to be something you were not. The next morning, Maeve found the old gardener, Gideon, working near the woodpile behind the kitchen. He was an elderly man with gnarled hands and a quiet demeanor. Maeve asked him for a pair of thick leather gloves and a set of iron shears, stating that she intended to begin clearing the weeds from the old winter glasshouse. Gideon looked at her with surprise, but he quickly fetched the tools from his shed, leading her to the structure at the edge of the woods. The glasshouse was large, its iron frame rusted, and many of its glass panes broken, allowing the winter snow to drift inside. Dead rose briars and tangled weeds choked the gravel paths, their dry stalks frozen solid in the cold air. Maeve spent 4 hours that afternoon cutting away the dead wood, her hands growing warm from the hard physical labor. She focused on the task, finding comfort in the simple, repetitive motion of the shears. Caspian watched her from the window of his shaded second-floor study. He stood back in the shadows where the sunlight could not reach his pale skin, his silver eyes tracking her movements across the frozen garden. He had expected her to spend her days writing letters or visiting the local town, as other women of her station did. He had not expected to see his Duchess working in the dirt, her face smudged with soot, her hair coming loose from its pins as she cleared away the remnants of the past. He felt a strange, unfamiliar warmth stirring within his chest as he watched her work day after day. He had spent 3 years enveloped in his own cold grief, believing that his heart was as dead as the stone walls of his house. He knew his own nature. He was a creature who belonged to the darkness, destined to outlive the mortals around him. Yet this quiet human woman was bringing a steady, persistent light into his frozen world, and he found himself unable to look away. One afternoon, Maeve returned to the house to find a small brass key sitting on the library table. Aunt Beatrix was nowhere to be seen, but the old woman's book lay open beside the key, a clear indication of her intent. Maeve took the key, her heart beating a little faster, as she walked toward the end of the long gallery that led to the forbidden east wing. She reached the heavy oak door and inserted the key, the lock turning with a smooth, heavy click. The air inside the east wing was cold and perfectly still, smelling faintly of old cedar and dried lavender. She walked down the dim corridor, opening the door to a large sitting room. The space looked as though its occupant had simply stepped out for a brief walk. A half-finished letter lay on the desk, alongside a silver riding crop and a pair of leather boots. Maeve stepped closer to the desk, her eyes falling on the bold, hurried handwriting of the younger brother. The letter was addressed to Caspian, telling him not to worry so much about the new stallion. Tristan had written that he could handle the animal, laughing at his older brother's constant caution and challenging him to a race to the river the following morning. Maeve felt a deep sadness welling up inside her as she realized the true depth of Caspian's torment. He had carried the weight of those final words for 3 long years, believing his love had failed to protect his brother. A sudden sound made her turn. Caspian stood in the doorway, his face pale as death, his white hair catching the shadows of the dim room. His silver eyes were wide, with a raw, sudden anger that made the air in the corridor grow instantly cold. He asked her why she had come to this place, his voice a low, dangerous whisper that echoed against the wooden walls. Maeve did not step back. She looked at his pained face and told him that she had come because she wanted to understand the man she had married. She stated that she saw the room of a young man who had loved his brother, not a place of shame or failure. She reached out, her hand steady as she placed her fingers against his cold arm, offering her warmth to his icy frame. Caspian looked down at her hand, his breathing ragged, the tight control he had maintained for years, finally beginning to break in the quiet of the room. The heavy silence that had hung over the east wing did not return. The following morning, Caspian gave instructions to the staff to open the windows and clean the long-neglected rooms, allowing the winter light to chase away the settled dust. The servants moved through the corridors with a lighter step, their voices rising above the fearful whispers that had defined the household for years. Mrs. Weaver was heard laughing in the kitchen, a sound that had not occurred since Tristan's death. Caspian began joining Maeve for their morning meals at the small round table. He sat in the pale light, his white hair gleaming, listening as she described her progress in the glass house. She told him that Gideon had helped her replace the broken glass panes and that they had discovered several old rose bushes that were still alive beneath the tangled weeds. Caspian offered to have a load of rich soil brought up from the valley, his voice carrying a soft warmth that Maeve had never heard before. They spent their evenings in the library, reading by the fire. Caspian shared stories of his youth, describing the history of the northern forests and the traditions of his people who had lived in the mountains for generations. Maeve found herself drawn to his sharp intelligence and the gentle respect he showed for her thoughts. She realized that she was no longer performing a role in a business arrangement. She was growing to love the mysterious man who had saved her from her family's cruelty. One evening, as the snow fell softly outside the glass, Caspian looked at her across the hearth. He told her that his Aunt Beatrix believed it was time for them to host a winter gathering for the local families to show the county that Coldbrook Manor was no longer a house of mourning. Maeve smiled, telling him that she thought it was an excellent suggestion, and that she would gladly oversee the preparations. The house became a center of activity for the next month. The large ballroom was uncovered, its crystal chandeliers polished until they shone like diamonds in the firelight. Invitations were sent to every estate in the valley, and the local town buzzed with excitement about the reclusive Duke's sudden return to society. Maeve worked closely with Mrs. Weaver on the menus, ensuring that the food was hearty and welcoming for their guests. Her mother and sisters, who had taken a short winter lease on a house in the nearby town, sent a letter confirming their attendance. Mrs. Gable wrote that she was anxious to see how Maeve was managing her grand new life, her words carrying the familiar tone of hidden skepticism. Maeve read the letter without any trace of fear, knowing that she was no longer the defenseless girl they had left behind in Philadelphia. On the night of the ball, Maeve stood before the long mirror in her dressing room. Hazel had styled her dark hair in a simple, elegant knot that revealed the clean lines of her neck. She wore a gown of heavy silk the color of the midnight sky, a deep, luminous blue that Caspian had ordered for her from the city. The fabric caught the lamplight with every movement, making her eyes appear bright and clear. There was a soft knock on the door, and Caspian stepped into the room. He wore a formal black coat, his white hair contrasting sharply with his dark attire, his pale skin appearing perfectly smooth. He stopped when he saw her, his silver eyes widening with an emotion that made Maeve's heart beat faster. He walked toward her, his long fingers gently touching the silver necklace around her throat, telling her that she looked completely magnificent. The grand ballroom blazed with light as the guests began to arrive. Musicians played a lively waltz from the upper gallery, and the floor was filled with the movement of colorful silk dresses and dark coats. Maeve stood beside Caspian at the entrance, greeting their neighbors with a calm, easy grace that won the immediate respect of the local families. Caspian stayed close to her side, his hand resting gently against her waist as he introduced her as his Duchess. Mrs. Gable and her daughters entered the room an hour later, their loud voices and bright dresses drawing the attention of those nearby. Vivian looked around the magnificent ballroom with obvious envy, her lips tightening as she saw Maeve standing at the center of the gathering. Mrs. Gable walked over, her eyes scanning Maeve's beautiful gown and the expensive pearls in her hair, offering a greeting that sounded forced and thin. A young woman named Victoria Davenport, who had long hoped to catch Caspian's attention, joined the Gable family near the refreshment tables. Victoria remarked loudly that it was fascinating to see how a plain girl from Philadelphia could be transformed by a wealthy title, suggesting that the marriage must have been a great act of charity on the Duke's part. Vivian laughed softly behind her fan, agreeing that Maeve had always been a quiet thing who required someone else to clear her path. Maeve stepped onto the stone terrace later in the evening to catch a breath of the crisp winter air. The moon was high and full, casting a silver glow over the snow-covered pine trees below. She had not been there for more than a minute when Vivian and Victoria followed her out, their smiles sharp in the moonlight. Victoria told Maeve that she should not grow too comfortable in her grand surroundings, stating that a man like Caspian would eventually tire of a quiet ghost who had been bought to settle a family debt. Vivian added that everyone in the city knew the truth of the arrangement and that Maeve would always be nothing more than a practical solution to a financial problem. Maeve turned to face them, her expression calm, her voice steady, as she told them that she pitied their inability to see beyond the surface of things. She stated that her life was her own now, and that their words no longer carried any power to hurt her. A cold wind suddenly swept across the terrace, and Caspian stepped out from the shadows of the stone archway. His white hair seemed to gleam under the full moon, and his pale skin looked sharp and dangerous as he walked toward the group. His silver eyes were fixed on Victoria and Vivian with a chilling intensity that made both women step back in sudden fear. He took Maeve's hand in his own, his grip iron cold and completely protective. He told Victoria that she was a guest in his home, a home that was ruled by his wife with a grace that none of them could ever hope to match. He looked at Vivian, his voice dropping to a low, powerful tone that carried across the terrace, stating that he had gone to the city looking for a woman of true worth, and he had found only one. He declared that his marriage to Maeve was the single wisest choice of his existence, and that he loved her for her strength, her intelligence, and the life she had brought back to his dying home. He told them that any further insult to his Duchess would be considered an insult to himself, and that their presence was no longer desired at Coldbrook Manor. He called for the footman to bring their carriages immediately, delivering a social dismissal that left both women pale and speechless as they hurried away. The terrace grew perfectly quiet once the guests had departed. Caspian turned to Maeve, his face softening as he looked down at her. He guided her away from the ballroom and up the stairs to his private study, closing the heavy oak door to shut out the remaining sounds of the music below. A single lamp burned on his desk, casting long shadows across the walls of the dark room. He took both of her hands in his silver eyes, looking into her own with a deep, open honesty that she had never seen before. He told her that his words on the terrace had been the complete truth, and that he had fallen deeply in love with her. He explained that he had lived for centuries in the darkness, believing that he was destined to remain an isolated creature of the night, forever separated from the warmth of the living world. He told her that her quiet resilience and her gentle touch had broken through the ice of his grief, showing him that it was possible to find a new beginning even after the deepest loss. Maeve felt tears of complete joy rising in her eyes as she listened to his confession. She reached up, her hands framing his pale face, telling him that she loved him for the man he was, and that she would gladly stand by his side through all the years to come. Caspian pulled her into his arms, his mouth finding hers in a deep, gentle kiss that sealed the bond between them. It was a promise that carried no trace of their original financial arrangement, a true joining of two spirits who had found their home in the most unexpected of places. The massive stone manor around them felt warm and alive, its long silence finally replaced by the promise of a shared future. 1 year later, the Winter Glatz house at Coldbrook Manor was filled with the vibrant color of white roses, their sweet scent filling the warm air inside the structure. Maeve walked along the gravel path, her hand resting gently on her stomach, which was round with the promise of their first child. She looked out through the glass panes at the pine trees, their branches green against the melting snow of an early spring. Caspian walked down the path to join her, his white hair catching the bright morning sun, his pale face relaxed and full of peace. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, his touch no longer feeling cold to her, but familiar and deeply comforting. They stood together in the center of the blooming garden, looking forward to the life they were building in the heart of the northern woods. Maeve thought about the path that had brought her to this place, from the dark parlor in Philadelphia to the queen of this vast stone estate. She realized that her quietness had never been a weakness. It had been the strength that allowed her to wait for a love that was real and true. She knew that the future would bring its own challenges, but as she looked into her husband's silver eyes, she felt completely certain that their love would remain as steady and enduring as the ancient trees around them. The years ahead no longer looked like a long stretch of empty days spent trying to please a world that did not care. Standing here in the warmth of the glass house, Maeve could see the shape of a life built on mutual respect and a quiet understanding that did not need to shout to be felt. They had both known the weight of being misunderstood, of living in environments where their true selves had to be hidden away for survival. In finding each other, they had managed to create a sanctuary where the shadows were no longer things to fear, but spaces where growth could happen at its own necessary pace. She watched a single drop of water fall from a glass pane onto the petals of a white rose, a small reminder that even the coldest season eventually yields to the persistent pressure of the spring. Her family's small cruelties and the city's frantic demands had faded into distant memories, leaving only the solid reality of the stone house, the husband who truly saw her, and the new generation that would soon run through the wide marble halls. It was a quiet sort of victory, one not with anger or display, but with the simple willingness to hold out for a place where she belonged. She leaned back against Caspian's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his breath, content to let the world move on outside their gates, while they tended to the life they had chosen to cultivate together.